This video will explain why the Turkish arrows are made with super tight snap-on nocks. So this is an original Turkish flight arrow. I've studied these quite a lot and I made some copies. I used these when I set the world records. And they have a really sturdy snap-on function. So once they're on the string, they really won't come off unless they're shot or pulled off. So it's really quite sturdy, and I think you can even hold the bow like this and they won't come off. So why would they make them like this? It doesn't make any sense. Wouldn't it make more sense to make them really loose so they would spend no energy letting go of the string? I'm sure you're losing some distance with this hefty snap-on. It's noisy even. And it's very tight in the opening, but in the inner parts of the nock, it's really loose. So it doesn't make any sense, right? This doesn't stay anywhere you'd like, but it's really tight in the opening. But they were all made like this, so why? So let's look at what happens when an arrow is drawn on a Turkish bow. And for demonstration purposes, I have a 16-pound composite here. And let's see, so 16 pounds versus the snap-on nock. Oh. So let's consider the angle between the string and the arrow. Of course, now it's 90 degrees, but what happens when this is drawn towards full draw? I'm not going to be able to draw full draw here, but you see there, it's like pretty close to 45 degrees. And so what happens when you get towards the full draw? The angle between the arrow and the string is basically like this. And so what you need is a type of nock that will hold on to the string even though the string is angled like this. Regular snap-on nocks, they're just made normally to hold the arrow when it's 90 degrees against the string. Because normally you shoot with 3 fingers, and then as you draw, the string is basically always 90 degrees. But when you're shooting with a thumb ring, you're putting it underneath the arrow, and then you're drawing from there. And so you end up with the arrow actually being like this at full draw. So let's have a better look close up here. As you can see, the arrow is quite loose when it's at 90 degrees. The opening is quite tight, so it's not gonna fall off, but it's quite loose and it doesn't make much sense, right? But again, if you continue moving it, and then imagining this string being drawn towards full draw, the nock, when it gets towards the end, like so, here, this is full draw, and then the nock is tight. So it's quite clear that this type of nock is designed to allow the string to be pushing from this point on. So you draw it to full draw, and then you release, and then basically the string is like this just before you release. So loose and tight. Now you might say that, oh, I'm just going to hold the arrow when I'm drawing, so the arrow isn't going to fall off. But consider this when you're using a sipor like this. Then what you need is, first of all, you need a nocking point above the nock. So it will sit like so. If I let go now, it will just fall off, but like so. So when you're drawing this, you're not able to touch the arrow at all because the arrow is supposed to lay in the middle of the sepal groove. And if you're touching the arrow at all, it'll move outside. And worst case scenario is hitting the bow and exploding in front of your face. So what it's really important when you're using the sipur to not touch the arrow at all. So basically, you knock the arrow and then you draw with the thumb below. So there's no touching the arrow at all. It's just resting in the sipur and resting on the string and on the knocking point. Of course, I don't have a knocking point here now. So you could decide just not to use a snap-on knock and just try, and then maybe the arrow would fall off the string when you're drawing. This would represent the danger of dry losing or dry firing the bow. And no doubt the Turkish bows are the most efficient historical designs for shooting lightweight arrows. And even with these 200 grain arrows, they're shot with like 50% efficiency. And so it means that 50% of the energy from the bow is transferred to the arrow. So it's really far from dry firing. But they're really not made to cope with the stresses of dry firing. So I thought I'd show you some bow tips, some original bow tips actually. They have various methods of reinforcing the tips. So here we have 4 tips of some Ottoman Turkish composite bows. And to the very left there is a so-called sinirsek, and it's a dedicated flight bow. It has just a sinew wrapping below the nock as a reinforcement. There's a little bit of string on the top because the very tip has been replaced. But mainly the sinew wrapping below the nock. That's what's keeping the wood from splitting. And the 2 middle ones, let's call them sporting bows. One is leather covered, the other bark covered. But the nocks, they are just wood and leather. And the way you make this is that you wet the leather and then it gets pliable enough that you can wrap one piece of leather around all of this. And then once it's dry, then you can cut off the excess. The very last one to the right, it's a war bow, and it has both the sinew wrapping and the leather lining. And well, it took me quite some time to get used to the idea of making bows with no wrapping around the nock, because when we make bows we usually secure the tips or the nocks extra with some wrapping. But I tried some years ago and it actually works very nicely. I had no problem with it. That is until now. Because one bow was a bit unlucky. And I'll show you that one next. And here is one of the bows that I made, also with just the leather lining. And so here I have replaced the war bow with one of the bows that I made, the unlucky bow. As you can see, this is also just wood and leather in the nock. And what happened here is likely that the arrow nock fell off the string during the draw, and then the bowstring was released with no arrow on it. And then, yeah, the bow was dry fired basically. Not intentionally, of course, but this is something that happens if you play the game. And the reason I know that this is not just a material defect or even a defect in my work is that this happened to both tips at the same time. And so for this to happen on both sides, I think it must be a dry fire. Which is sad, of course, but the tips of the Turkish bows, they're quite easily repairable. And when you see the old bows, they're quite often repaired. Sometimes the whole tip has been replaced. And so I have a little theory that maybe they used this kind of nock because it was easier to replace the tips than to have the tips really solid and then the damage to go on further down into the limbs. Because if the damage is done in the kazan or even the sal, then the bow is pretty much dead. But the tips, they can be repaired. So maybe this is sort of a fuse. It's just an idea. So to sum up, I think there are good reasons for this somewhat strange shape of the Turkish nocks. Being really sure that the arrow won't fall off the string when you're drawing it makes for a lot of confidence in the shot. And as we know, competing with confidence helps a lot. And it's also important for the life of the bow, of course. I am a little curious if this type of tip with the sinew wrapping, if this would be able to withstand the bow being dry fired. These ones with just the leather lining, they don't. So now we know. Lessons learned. The tips of this bow will be repaired, and it's not a quick repair, but it's a fairly easy repair. So it'll shoot again. So now that I got you to stay to the end of the video, I have a little bonus for you, because I'm quite sure that you're interested in hearing this original arrow snap onto the bowstring. It's not something that I would do normally, but let's make an exception, because you're all watching after all. Good sound, huh? And oh look, it works. Oh, poor thing.
Good sound, huh?